Okay, can you hear me okay? Thanks very much to Camelot for inviting me. I realise we're now deep into the graveyard shift after lunch, so if I do start to fall asleep, someone just come and slap me on the cheek or something like that. My strategy for keeping you awake is to pummel you with PowerPoint. Here we go. Well, I strung together about 6 different presentations in the hope that it'll keep you awake, but it might do the opposite. So, briefly about me, I'm the policy lead for the Empty Homes Network. My background in empty homes was starting as an empty homes officer for Exeter City Council back in 1996. And what we're going to talk about, a little bit about the Empty Homes Network itself, a bit about the essential ingredients for bringing an empty home back into occupation, a little bit about money, which is quite important, something about local authorities in particular and empty homes, some of the barriers to success, and some pointers for progress. But just to be clear, because I know a lot of you are involved in commercial property, essentially this is really about residential property, about the classic empty home. So the Empty Homes Network, what we're about is we're a membership organisation, started in about 2000, 2001. The core membership at that time were people like myself whose job titles were Empty Homes Officer or Empty Property Officer. You might not even realise that such people existed, but they do exist. And we've expanded our membership, and we have lots of environmental health officers, and we have lots of housing strategy and housing enabling officers. We've now got housing associations involved, we've got community groups, we've got private sector firms, so we've grown to about 500 individual people in the network. And fundamentally what we do is supporting the people who bring empty properties back into use for housing. We're a mutual support network. And the focus, however, is on private sector empty, so we're not tending to look at empty properties that are owned by social landlords or councils. Now, so the sort of things we do, a lot of it's interactive. Our members are scattered all over the country, so our website's a very important part of what we do, and it does all the sorts of things that you might expect the website to do. It's got forums where people exchange information and experience and expertise. We have an information library, lots of technical, totally obscure information about empty homes that empty homes practitioners need to know. There's a lot of specialism there. It's all tagged up so that people can get to it, quite carefully tagged, because it can be quite hard to find some of this information. We have news stories to keep people in the loop. Some of our news stories are quite detailed. We're talking about a freedom of information case, something like that, related to empty homes. And we also have practitioner guides for our paying members. Most of our members pay, and they get quite detailed guides about specific things to do with empty homes. So that's what we're about. So getting back to the basics about empty homes, just to remind you stuff that I know you already know. Why are people bothered about empty homes? They're bothered about homes standing empty when other people are homeless. And we've got, this is the last quarter that's been published of the CLG statistics. There's 53,000 households in temporary accommodation. They've been accepted as homeless, but they haven't been given a permanent home. And 38,000 of those households have got children. Nuisance to neighbours. You live next door to an empty property. The rain's coming through the roof and into your house. People are standing around outside creating a disturbance. Vermin possibly, dilapidation, devalues your property, and then the kind of the bigger picture is a whole neighbourhood can get blighted by empty homes if you've got several of them. It's not such a good place to live. This one comes up all the time. Building on greenfield sites. Virtually every greenfield site that you see being put forward for development, people say, why are you building on that greenfield site when we've got all these empty homes? And finally, climate change. This is something that's come to light perhaps more recently. You build a new home, of course that's much more energy efficient than an old home, but there's a lot of embodied energy in the old home which you don't have to do if you reuse it, and if you build a new one there's a lot of embodied energy in that, the bricks and mortar literally, and it can take 50 years before the operational costs of a new dwelling outweigh the or the benefits start to outweigh what would have happened if you just reused an existing property. So that's why people care. And the question is, how do we get from that to that? This is in Kent. So, in my view, councils are key to that process. Councils have the legal powers, they have enforcement powers, they have information, for example, in the form of council tax. They have the contacts. They should know the local markets, they know how things work locally. And they have a legal and moral obligation to do things about housing and about the environment. And they actually have access to funding, although that's often not widely enough recognised in local authorities themselves. Councils should lead, in our view, in their areas on the issue of empty homes. And so they should plan for success, and here's a couple of empty home strategies. One's Exeter, one Plymouth. I come from Exeter, so that's why I've picked ones from the area that I live in. You need a plan. It doesn't happen by accident. And these are the sorts of things that you can do to bring empty properties back into use. This is a kind of pyramid. And what you've got down here are what you might call the low-intensity interventions, like advice and guidance. And up here, you've got the really heavy things like compulsory purchase or empty dwelling management order. So this is from Kent. They're very good at keeping statistics. They've got a very well-thought-out empty home strategy, which is actually a partnership of Kent County Council and I think 13 districts. And just to look at what works in empty homes, actually advice and guidance, 58%, will help bring an empty property back into use. Interest-free loans that they do down in Kent, 18%. Threat of enforcement or actual enforcement is 11%. It's only 1 in 10 cases that you need to use enforcement down in Kent. 7% is other, which includes things like going to auction. Grants are 3%, and these really heavy things that sometimes make the news, like compulsory purchase, only 3%. So those are the approaches that they use down in Kent. I'm interested in looking more closely at the process, about this sort of, in a kind of generic way, at what's involved, because I think we lose sight of it. And I see 3 main components: engaging with the owner, refurbishing the property, which actually has 2 subcomponents, and ensuring successful occupation. And I'll kind of try to demonstrate why it matters to think about these things separately. So, engaging with owners, you've got to find the empties. Where are the empties? They don't come to you, you have to go to them. Identifying who owns the empty properties. Building relationships with the owners. Establishing what their particular circumstances are. Offering advice and information. Promoting solutions to them. Maybe, in the worst case, taking enforcement action. That's engaging with the owners. Then we've got refurbishment, because most of these properties are likely to need some works. Not all of them, but most of them. And I see 2 quite different parts to that. One of which is about managing the process. So establishing what the appropriate standards are, inspecting the property, a lot of technical stuff around what you need to do to that property to bring it back into use. And possibly then also procuring the works on behalf of the owner and supervising the works, and eventually inspecting it and signing it off. And possibly funding and legal agreements might come into that. And then you've got the actual work of refurbishing the property, and you can see all the trades illustrated here. And then you've got to actually get it occupied. You've got to market it. You've got to set up a tenancy agreement if it's going to be tenanted. You've got to manage the tenancy if it's going to be tenanted. You've got to collect the rent and deal with repairs. Now, the point about this is that you've got 4 key roles here, in fact. And I think it's just worth pausing and thinking for a moment that these 4 roles are actually completely different from one another. You want to get one outcome, bringing an empty home back into use, but what you do to achieve that involves quite a range of completely different skills. And so the question is who actually does do those things? Now, the ideal, I suppose, is 4 roles that are all working together. If you've got 4 roles that are all working together, you've got an integrated vehicle of some sort. You've got a delivery vehicle. If you do it by different people, then you've got a delivery partnership. And if you can offer those things to an empty property owner, those different things, what you've got is a simple solution for that owner of that empty property. Now, I know that sounds incredibly common sense, but it's so common sense it's not worth perhaps even mentioning. But in fact, that solution doesn't exist in all that many areas. So, I mean, we did it to some extent in Exeter. We had a thing called Extralet, which was like a letting agent. We had money for grants, and we could say to people, sign on the dotted line. That's all you need to do. You don't have to fill out all these forms. You don't have to go and get 3 tenders from a builder. You don't have to try and interpret this 15-page grant document. Just sign on the dotted line. Okay, it was a 15-page lease document, but there's only one thing that they had to do. Now, that option doesn't exist in very many local authority areas around the country. In fact, where it does exist, as in Exeter, even there it's quite limited, because we were securing accommodation for homeless households. So that meant we were restricted in the sorts of homes that we wanted. So often, you might find if you're in a rural area, well, I'll get onto that in a moment. If you're in a rural area, they'll say, well, we don't want, for our homeless needs, we don't want houses out in the country, we don't want 5-bed houses, we don't want 1-bed flats, we don't want listed buildings. So that simple thing of saying to an owner, we'll take your property, we'll bring it back into use, we'll deduct reasonable costs and you can get the balance, doesn't actually exist. That's why I want to emphasise the need for integrated solutions. Now, I've mentioned there are different ways of doing the integrated solution, and one way of doing it is to do it in-house, as I call it. This is the in-house solution, which if you work in a local authority, you'll probably recognise. There's your empty homes officer, somewhere there, that's the empty homes officer, caught up in the machinery of a local authority, trying to get things done. Because when I started as an empty homes officer for Exeter, I had a 3-day-a-week job, and that council employed, let's say, about 1,000 people. So you've got a business, Exeter City Council in that case, which employs 1,000 people, and its empty homes function is a 3/5 of a week. So the organisation as a whole is not geared towards the problem of bringing empty properties back into use. So I don't think that is generally the best way to go. Horses for courses, basically. Because big organisations like things like this. They like lots of things that are all the same. But unfortunately, empty properties aren't like that. Empty properties are very individual. They're scattered around and they're all different. So you need a much more kind of individualised approach that's very responsive to that individual situation. So let's go back to the 4 key roles. That's the empty homes officer up there, the kind of enabler, engaging with owners, specification of works, quality control, refurbishment works. That job, I believe, is best done by the council for the reasons I've said. They've got all the information. They can put together a package. They can make things happen. That's what council should do. But specification of works or quality control, that's really a job for building surveyors or architects. Now, councils may employ those people, but those people are probably doing commercial buildings. They're not geared towards the residential market. Refurbishment works, best done by small builders. You can use the really big firms if you want, because that's what you as a council normally do, but they won't be efficient when you want to bring a single street empty property back into use. Bolton, when they did their first empty dwelling management order, they went out to tender and they used a small local private builder, and their quote was 70% of the cost of the lowest housing association doing the same job. And sustained occupation, well, the owner might actually be the person to manage the letting if they wanted to do it. Letting agents, there's plenty of letting agents around, and housing associations. Now, perhaps the point here is that it is horses for courses, and also actually all these skills and all the skill and expertise and resource is available out there. There's nowhere in Britain that doesn't have these resources available. When you try and do it in a council or in a housing association, you often find you can't do it. Well, we haven't got anyone to manage the property. And this is what actually happens. And yet, all over the place, there are letting agents who will manage properties for you. So, in my view, if you can't do it yourself, and it's maybe not best to even attempt to do it yourself, procure it. That, to me, is a challenge for local authorities. Go and procure the services you need. Be clear about what you want and go and procure it. Great if you can do it in-house, if you can do it in-house properly, but go out and procure it if you can't. Don't just give up and say, well, we can't do it. An interesting little anecdote actually came to me from a colleague who's here today. They've just gone out to get some legal expertise to do compulsory purchase orders. And there's a firm that specialises in compulsory purchase orders doing work for local authorities called NP Law. So they've gone out to get that work done. They've outsourced it, and that's great. But what amused me was that he told me that it took the in-house legal team 3 years to realise that they couldn't do it. So it might be, true. Okay. Now, I don't know what I was going to say about this slide. It's in this. I must have meant to say something about it. I have no idea what it was. But when you have your integrated solution that you can offer to owners, you've actually, in a sense, got a fifth role because you actually want to really market that. There's a marketing thing to be done about what you can offer empty property owners. And of course, the other thing you need, the fifth element that we haven't talked about, is cash. Because if you look at, we've got this, the BRE have done a study. This is the Building Research Establishment. They know all about buildings, apparently. They've looked at long-term empties. Long-term empty means empty for longer than 6 months. That's the standard definition. The refurbishment costs, these are the average refurbishment costs. Urgent repairs 8,000, basic repairs 9,000, comprehensive treatment, which is probably what you need to do if you're going to, say, go on and let the property, £12,000. Now that's the mean. If that's the mean of properties that have been empty for 6 months, then you'll appreciate that properties that have been empty longer will require a lot more money from that. And where will that come from? Well, I'll tell you about that in a moment, but there's a very important point here, and this is a really important point to me. What is the risk of investing money in a long-term empty property? Now, generally, if a property's been empty for a long time, it can only have been empty for a long time because there's actually a lot of equity in it. If there was a big mortgage on it, it probably would have been repossessed. That's not always the case. I'm clear about it, it's not always the case, but very, very, very frequently, the worst empty properties have a lot of equity in it. So the risk of you investing in that empty property, if you were able to get a charge on the property, and a lot of them don't have any mortgage at all, so you'd be a sort of first charge, is low. It is a low-risk investment to invest in many long-term empty properties. And that has very considerable implications for how creative you maybe want to be about tackling empty homes. You ought to be able to get your money back if things kind of go wrong. So we've got these sources of funding. I won't read through there. Private sector. The private sector solve most empty property problems. It's not done by local authority, it's done by the private sector. A home has been standing empty for 2 years and it gets bought in the normal course of market operations. Thank you. The private sector do most of the work. And so that's where a lot of the money comes from. It comes from portfolio landlords, it comes from a potential owner-occupier borrowing money. Difficult to borrow money on poor condition properties nowadays, though, incidentally. And we have got 1 or 2 specialist agencies around that are trying to get into empty property, Empty Home Solutions, and there's a new one called Property Liberation Company. I'm not endorsing them. I'm saying they are out there. They're people that are trying to find a wider range of solutions for empty property owners, including leasing them. Plymouth, for example, they've just won an award in our annual awards. They actually have a voluntary sale procedure whereby they hold keys, they've got a mailing list, they tell developers and people interested in properties about the empty property, they arrange viewings, they ask for sealed bids, and they do all that for free, no agent fees. But basically what they're doing is they're oiling the wheels of the private sector. So even local authorities can get involved in making the private sector work a bit more efficiently. And they run their award because of achieving actual results, where owners that didn't know what to do with the property wouldn't properly engage. When they said to them, look, this won't cost you anything, let's just test the market, went out and tested the market. And when you've got an offer in front of you that says, this person will buy this property for X amount of money, maybe that's the thing that will change your mind and get you to do something about it. Government grant via the Housing, Homes and Communities Agency. There have been 2 lots of funding. Maybe we're waiting to hear the results of the second lot. A bit annoying for those of us that are keen to promote local authorities, because they made it very difficult for most local authority schemes, or many local authority schemes wouldn't actually qualify for that funding. Didn't make a lot of sense to us. And the community grants programme was aimed at voluntary groups, more government funding, £30 million last time. We don't know how much this time. That's really great. Lots of small self-help organisations that can go and provide delivery vehicles. We're talking about delivery vehicles. That funding helps those delivery vehicles come into existence and deliver. And now the council. Now, amazingly enough, councils do have money. They've got reserves, and obviously they have to be very careful about what they do with their reserves. I mean, you don't want to give it to an Icelandic bank, for example. I mean, you do need it. It needs to be reasonably liquid. That's why it's reserves. But the fact is, at the moment, I talked to council yesterday. They estimated that they would earn 0.45% on their reserves. In fact, they're only going to earn 0.25% on their reserves. That's what's happening to your money sitting in the council's bank. That could be earning 5% as a loan to bring an empty home back into use. And going back to what I said about the fact that a lot of empty homes are not security risk, you know, it's time to start looking at these things. But that's not the end of it. Councils can do something called prudential borrowing, which they get from the Public Works and Loan Board. These are the sort of interest rates. This was downloaded yesterday. The interest rates change every single day. An interest only, so you repay the principal at the end on a 10-year loan, 3.2%. That's the most expensive interest rate you'll pay, 3.2%, 10-year loan, interest only, repay the principal at the end. I don't know how many commercial people are able to get money at those sorts of rates, but I wouldn't think very many. If you're doing a 5-year loan, and this is an equal instalment repayment, basically I think like a standard repayment mortgage, your interest rate 1.54%. Councils can get that money. They don't have to, you know, prove anything. You know, that money is sitting there waiting for councils to borrow it if they want it. In fact, the government have introduced something called a certainty rate, because they don't know what local authorities are going to do. And if you tell the government what you're going to do, you get a special preferential rate. And the council also get money from the new homes bonus. Now, the new homes bonus is supposed to encourage building of new homes. Absolutely rubbish at that. Anyone that knows anything about planning knows that the new homes bonus isn't going to work. But it does one great thing. It also incentivises you to bring empty homes back into use. And a council will earn 6 years national average council tax for bringing an empty home back into use. So if it's a Bandy property, they'll get £8,700. Now that £8,700 may not refurbish the property. It will certainly pay for some of that human work, that enabling work that goes on. Or it could cover some interest charges. You know, you could borrow money for the Public Works and Loan Board and pay it off with your new homes bonus. Social impact bonds, not-for-profit organisations are starting to explore this. Bristol Together, absolutely fantastic scheme. What they do is they buy up a rundown property, get it cheap, they employ ex-offenders to refurbish it, give them skills, fantastic social benefits there, massive reduction in reoffending. They then sell it. You know, it's completely private sector in its thinking. It's really fantastic. They sell it, they target a 10% return on their original investment, and they give money to the people that invest in the social impact bond. So suppose you're the Esme Fairbairn Trust, one of the biggest charities in the country. You've got all your resources in BP and Shell and tobacco and God knows what, and you're getting your return on it, and you give that return to charities. Instead of doing that, you can invest in a social impact bond with someone like Bristol Together, and you will get 3% or 4% return on that money, and you'll help this whole process happen. So there's a huge scope for expansion in that area on empty homes. Now, barriers to success. I spent 13 years working for a council. I've been self-employed. I've worked in the civil service. I've worked for a private sector firm of surveyors in partnership. A partnership, in other words, and I work for big multinational companies. So I've seen pretty much the widest range of things, and I greatly value the time I spent in local authority, and I greatly value what local authorities do, and I really don't like the way that local authorities get hammered all the time by the government, like to bang them, the local press like to bang them, but now I'm going to bang them. Because at the end of the day, there are certain problems with local authorities getting this work done around empty homes. So one of the problems is, short term, one of your council members says, I'm really excited about empty homes, we'll have an empty homes initiative, and it all becomes flavour of the month, and 2 years later it's all forgotten about. So you have a short term stop-go approach where the local empty homes initiative just doesn't go anywhere. It starts, it goes, and all that skill, and it's very skilled, it's very specialist, gets lost. Local authorities need to really learn to roll out what works. You know, you will recognise the evolution of the wheel. It's not that complicated. You invent it, you refine it, and then you roll it out, literally. So it's not a great idea to keep reinventing it all the time, because often you don't do a very good job when you're reinventing it, and you know, what's the point in all that when you already had a good wheel to start with? So rather than reinventing the wheel, what we need to do in local authorities is to do these jobs once. Standard legal documentation like loan agreements, grant agreements, lease agreements, nomination agreements, service level agreements. These need to be standardised, and they're not. And it annoys me because I'm a taxpayer as well. If you're just coming from outer space, what is going on here? You know, who believes that 300 local authorities should all be doing the same job? That 300 different lawyers in different local authorities should all be producing the same legal agreements? Now, when you're doing specialist things like empty homes, that's a really big overhead. If you're collecting rubbish, probably the overhead's not that great. You know, it's a big operation in one council. But if you're doing something really specialist, like developing a new loan agreement, you do that 300 times. That really is wasteful. And the worst thing about it is, because of that, things just don't get done. Or if they do get done, they get done badly. But often it's that inertia, all the process of reinventing stuff creates a huge amount of inertia in the system. Now, I have something called the Camelot comparison. I must emphasise that these slides were not developed for this conference. They were developed for a non-Camelot conference. Because I really love Camelot. I really love what they do. And they've got all this stuff they do, you know, that ISO accredited. They've got this imagination, because when I first came across them, they didn't do things like make space pay, and they didn't do things like the insurance options they developed. So what I'm really enthusiastic about with Camelot is not just the fact they do all this stuff like providing housing, but it's the focus. It's the focus of what they do. And so I just want you to think for a moment about what it would be like if 300 local authorities were running property guardian businesses up and down the country. Oh, hello. Would you get this kind of professionalism? Let's call it professionalism. Would you get this kind of professionalism if the property guardian business, which is run out of, let's say in the case of Camelot, out of 5 offices around the UK, were being run out of 300 local authorities? 300 local authorities. I think the answer is no. And you can reverse that question and say, what would it be like if local authorities could get together, as I think we ought to expect them to do as taxpayers, and actually create an organisation a bit more like Camelot to tackle empty homes in the most efficient and most effective way? So that's what you see, the glimmerings of it, like Kent, I've already mentioned, cross-boundary initiatives, sharing resources. And Somerset, 3 Somerset authorities have got 1 empty homes officer. Specialist suppliers like Norfolk Public Law, who specialise in CPO and do, I think, 30% of the CPO work in this country. That's the way we need to be going, efficient and effective. Now, the enabler, the man with the megaphone, could be a woman, often is. This is a photograph, this is a real photograph of an empty homes officer in one of the councils around the country. Well, you see that the system does weigh them down somewhat. This business of being, you know, one person out of staff of 1,000 in this massive corporate business that does hundreds of different things, you know, education, highways, schools, you name it, housing. And here's another one. You can see how he got in that situation. Meeting with higher management, can't be bothered, you can't do that, oh no, never heard of it, don't understand it. So for me, empty property officers, as I myself once was, are sort of unsung heroes, because they're not just fighting the empty homeowner. They're actually fighting their councils half the time if they work in councils. And so my hat's off. I take my hats off to them, and hope their world can get better, which can happen by challenging these barriers. And you know, you're all voters, and many of you know councillors. Don't accept inadequate responses from your council. So we need to challenge these cultural barriers in councils. Can't be bothered, too time consuming, too risky, don't understand it. You can't do that. You can do it, but we're too lazy to bother. Or the kind of alternative is, we'll just get on with it. You know, we're not going to train you, we're not going to give you any money, we're not going to support you in any way, but just get on with it. You're the empty homes person. We need to challenge that. And these are the 5 big ones for me that need to happen. I'm sorry I've gone on too long. The first thing is, we want a sort of all the options available in all the areas. So wherever you are in the country, if you've got an empty property, there is something that can help you. And particularly this all-in package for the owner, where it's sort of value for money, it's effectively marketed, there's capital available, you don't need to have money, and the capital's recycled, because we don't want to be giving money to empty property office, we want to be investing it and taking the benefit of the investment back. And empty homes delivery partnerships everywhere that meet all these delivery needs. We need to, I think, work with and procure from the third sector and the private sector much more effectively. They have the skills that we need out there. We want better funding models to sustain the initiative. It's very hit and miss. There's all these different funding streams. The government are giving the money, they're giving it to the housing associations to bring empty homes back into use for affordable housing, jump through this hoop, jump through that hoop, and that money's all got to be spent by the end of March 2015. It's a bit of a tall order. And then what happens? What happens if you're a community group and you manage to get some money to develop your work and to bring empty homes back into use, but you've got to spend the money by the end of 2015? What happens then? You've geared up to do something, but you don't know whether you can keep on doing it. So that needs to change. And this thing about replicable models, we need to find the models that work. You know, we've written to the government and said to the government, you know, why don't you evaluate the models that are out there and work out what are the best models, and you, as the government, this is a national problem, you take some steps to lead, to actually make sure that these models are replicated around the country. So that's my last slide. Sorry I've gone on too long. There's some contact details there, and thanks to Camelot for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbons.